Go ahead and find Psalm 4 with me. Psalm 4. Let's just begin by reading the psalm, Psalm 4 and verse 1. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. You remember the story of Chicken Little? Chicken is walking through the forest one day, and an acorn falls from a tree and hits her on the head, and what does Chicken Little say? Of course, she says, I'd better not rush to a hasty conclusion. Better conduct a full investigation to ascertain the sequence of events that led to me getting hit on the head. No, that's not what she says. Instead, she runs around telling everyone who will listen, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And so an hysterical mob gets whipped up among all the animals of the forest because of Chicken Little's hysteria. Eventually, they find someone who seems sympathetic to their worry, a fox, and he seems to have a solution. He says, why don't you come into this hole with me, and there you'll be safe from the falling sky, and they all go with him, and then he eats them. The moral is something like this. Don't be so quick to get caught up in hysteria. Just because everyone says the sky is falling doesn't mean that it is. It might just mean one Chicken Little got everyone else worked up into a fit. Hysteria gives us a false desperation that often leads us to foolishness and self-destruction. And yet, despite that caution from a children's story, it seems like hardly a day goes by anymore without someone, somewhere, crying, the sky is falling. Let me just begin with a very literal example of that. Turn on the Weather Channel, and what are you likely to see? Likely to see them talking about how the sky is literally falling, hurricanes and tornadoes and tropical storms. This is the exciting stuff people want to see. And so this is what they show. Turn on your TV to any news station and you will hear a chorus of voices proclaiming the end of civilization. What's funny is, I don't know if you've thought about this, in our discourse these days, opposite sides of an issue are often both arguing that the sky is falling just for different reasons. The basic outline of our discourse these days goes something like this. One group says the sky is falling because of this problem, and the other group says, no, the sky is falling because of the government's response to this problem. Social media has poured gasoline on our fiery hysteria. Alarm and outrage are the currency of social media. There's actually been a number of exposés over the last few years over how the algorithms of sites like Facebook and Twitter will favor the outrageous and the incendiary, not the sober and judicious. If you want your post to get maximum exposure, make it as hysterical as possible. Because hysteria means more clicks for the site, and more clicks for the site means more ad revenue for the site. Religious people are no strangers to the sky is falling hysteria. I actually think religious people might have invented it. Hardly a decade goes by without someone claiming that the world is about to end because they've done their secret calculations from the book of Daniel or Revelation, and the world is about to end. And then just on a personal anecdotal level, I cannot count the number of conversations I've had with people where I've been solemnly informed of some piece of legislation that's probably going to get me thrown into jail for preaching, or just Christians thrown into jail for this or that. People talking about impending economic collapse, prognostications about how we're all doomed because of this or that. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss or make light of all the things that people worry about. But what I do want to do today is to just inject us with a dose of scriptural sanity. Because David wrote this psalm in a sky is falling kind of moment. Something has happened in the world that has thrown his nation into a panic, and we'll talk about what that might have been. Voices all around David are telling him that everything is coming unhinged. And what I want us to see this morning is what Psalm 4 does when it seems like the sky is falling. And I'll tell you my simple point here up front. Disciples do not join Chicken Little's hysterical parade. Disciples do not join Chicken Little's hysterical parade. We don't respond to hysteria like the world does because we know things the world does not. It seems to me Satan has honed his ability to make us hysterical, to convince us the sky is falling, to convince us God is not in control, to convince us that the world is about to end. And he makes us so focused on the urgent news of the moment that we forget about unchanging truths about God. Sort of like the fox in the story. Satan knows how to use our hysteria for his benefit and our ruin. And he knows that in order to keep leading us where he wants us to go, he has to keep us in that hysterical state of mind. Because he knows if we were to drop that, if we were to stop believing his lies, his spell over us would be broken. If we'll listen to Psalm 4, the devil's spell can be broken, and we can be free to enjoy living under God's sky. I have this morning 4 points from Psalm 4. Number 1, when everyone says the sky is falling, look to God. This is verse 1. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. So this psalm wears David's name. We don't know exactly when it was written, but most commentators tie it together with Psalm 3. And we do know when Psalm 3 was written. Psalm 3 was written when David was deposed from his throne by his son Absalom. But regardless of when exactly it was written and under what circumstances, I just want you to see overall that there is trouble in the psalmist's life. So in verse 1 of the psalm, there is great distress. In verse 2, men are seeking lies and shaming the psalmist. In verse 4, there are angry people. In verse 6, there are people doubting God's providence. I just want you to see the sky is falling in this psalm or in the world of the psalmist. So what's a disciple to do? You don't have to get past verse 1 to notice a couple of very helpful things. Number 1, you call out to God. He says, answer me when I call. The very first thought of the psalmist is God. Something has happened. Maybe David is on the run because Absalom has turned the people against David. And so David's first response is to say, answer me, God. This is the pray without ceasing instinct. If you're worried that the sky is falling, then why not call on the God who made the sky? He's the only one that can do anything about it anyway. And even as he calls out to God, he's doing something else in verse 1. He is remembering God's past deliverances. So do you see what he says next? He says, you have given me relief when I was in distress. He is reflecting on a past event or past events. Now, the word translated distress in mine literally means narrow. We would say, you've given me relief when I was in the narrows. Or today we might put it this way, God, you've helped me out of tight spots before. And then the psalm says, God, I call on you to do for us again what you have done so many times in the past. He says, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. When we remember how God has come through for us in the past, in our own personal history with God and in God's history with his people in the Bible, when we remember how God has come through for us in the past, we remind ourselves that he has a power and wisdom we cannot comprehend. It's all God is ever doing in the Bible is delivering his people out of left field, and they don't even see it coming half the time. God somehow brought his people before. In our own lives, we have stories, I am sure, where God comes through for us in ways we never saw coming. He's somehow brought us through before, David says, and he can do it again. It's not as if he's run out of power. Remember God's past deliverances. There's a lot in this psalm that reminds me of another passage of Psalm 4 that reminds me of Philippians 4. In Philippians 4, one of the things Paul does is recommends prayer as an anxiety replacement. Do you remember what he says? Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Paul doesn't just say to the anxious Christian, he doesn't just say, don't be anxious. Man up, stop feeling that way. He doesn't say that. Instead, he says, answer every anxiety with prayer. Never let worry get the last word. What you do is you aim prayer at each one of your worries, and then you pull the trigger. So this is what I'm trying to say in verse 1. There's really nothing profound here. There are times when we just need to remember the basics. Who made us? Whose world is it? Who are we talking to when we pray? We believe there is a God who created and upholds all things. We're going to study this psalm this evening, but Psalm 24 and verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell in it." This is God's earth, and every single creature on this earth belongs to God. We pray to a God who, when he sees the nations rage, when he sees the rulers of the earth plot against him, when he sees a conspiracy of earth to throw off God and his shackles and do what we want, when God sees all of these evil things happening on his earth, in Psalm 2 it says that he sits in heaven and he laughs at them and he holds them in derision. Do you remember when Jesus taught us this? Jesus taught us the problem with our prayers is never that God lacks sufficient power. More often than not, the problem with our prayers is that we lack sufficient faith in God's power. We pray to a God with a long history of relieving the distress of his people. And so if there's a new distress, how about a renewed cry to God? Isn't that a better response than wringing our hands and worrying? Number one, when everyone says the sky is falling, David says, you just start with the basics. You remember who God is, you remember what God has done, and you start praying. Number two, when everyone says the sky is falling, do not listen to faithless voices. So I want you to notice this about the psalm. Verse 1 and verse 8 are both addressed to God. In verse 1, answer me when I call, O God. Verse 8, you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. He's addressing God in verses 1 and 8. But everything in between, in verses 2 through 7, the majority of the psalm actually seem to be David's words not directed at God, but directed at his panicked countrymen. It's almost as if I imagine David has to interrupt his prayer because all of these hysterical people, and he has to speak some sense into them. So I want you to notice in verse 2, he changes the direction of his words. He says, now, O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? And here's David's response to them. No, but know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call him. So I actually think the context of Absalom's coup, Absalom deposing David from the throne, makes pretty good sense of these verses. Absalom had convinced many in Israel that he was now the rightful heir to David's throne. The logic of Absalom's argument goes something like this. In the aftermath of David's sin with Bathsheba and the subsequent cover-ups, this had all caused David to forfeit his place as God's anointed. And now David is in the same boat that Saul was. Saul turned his back on God, and God said, Saul is no longer my anointed king. Absalom's argument is, that's now happened to my father. He's abandoned God, he has sinned, and now God's abandoned him. I'm the rightful king. All David is now is a failed and washed up old king. I think we can read verse 2 as David interrogating those who have believed Absalom's lies. They have become Chicken Little's hysterical parade, and he says to them in verse 2, why do you continue to listen to faithless voices? Why do you have such an appetite for lies and conspiracies? Why are you so eager to turn the honor of God's anointed king into shame? It's almost like you want what Absalom says to be true. In verse 3, David urges his brethren to sift through the lies and hysteria and to remember the promises God made, which are always true. Verse 3, know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call him. No matter what the headlines say, God is still in relationship with his people. No matter what the headlines say, God always hears the prayers of his people. No matter what the headlines say, God is still faithful to his promises. And so the message of David is this: turn away from the panic, verse 2, and turn toward the God of covenant in verse 3. And I want to show you, this isn't some psychological trick David is advocating here. Some, mental trick we play to manage our stress. That's not what he's doing here. What he's giving here is objective truth. What he's talking about in verse 3 is the very nature and character of God. He is giving the truest things in the world here. What he tells us is turn away from the world's words in verse 2 and turn toward God's words in verse 3. There just comes a time when we have to step away from the chorus of voices all declaring that the sky is falling. We have to step away from the people in verse 2, and we just have to say with David, you know what? The Lord knows me, and the Lord hears me, and that's kind of good enough. Absalom's supporters can keep spouting their nonsense about David, but David's going to be okay as long as the Lord hears when David calls. And pundits can keep making their doomsday predictions. Charlatans can keep prophesying Armageddon. Fearmongers can keep making projections about the growth of Islam. Atheists can keep asserting the death of Christianity. But you know what's always true? The Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call him. All the lies and hysteria in the world can never take that away. There's an interesting story told a couple of times in the Old Testament, in 2 Kings 18 and Isaiah 36. It's a story where Assyria's mighty army marches to the gates of Jerusalem and surround the city. And they send out their chief officer to present the alternative. They actually send out a Hebrew-speaking Assyrian officer so that all of Israel will hear his taunts and cower and impose on their leadership to just surrender. And the Assyrian officer says to those behind the Jerusalem gates, he says, either surrender or we'll besiege the city. We can either do this the easy way, which means you just come out, surrender, and we march you off into exile, or you can act like you're going to fight us or something, or hole up in your city, and we'll starve you out, and then we'll set fire to your city, and then we'll kill a bunch of you, and then we'll do what we're going to do in the first place and enslave the rest of you. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. And he comes out speaking in Hebrew, so Jerusalem will hear and understand his taunts. And he makes an argument, actually. He appeals to the theology of the Israelites. He says, Israel, don't think your God will save you. Because, lots of other cities have trusted in their gods, and we've conquered every last one of them. And whatever you do, don't trust Hezekiah, your king, if he tells you to trust God, because don't you know what Hezekiah did? Hezekiah went through and tore down all your idols. You have no power. You don't even have an idol. See, the pagan Assyrians assumed that all of Hezekiah's reforms of tearing down idols had only weakened God's power. To the pagan mind, less idols means less gods, and less gods means less divine power to help out. To the Assyrian mind, we've got 50 gods, and you've just got the one. Let me ask, what would have happened to Jerusalem had they listened to faithless Assyria? Had they swallowed down the pagan logic of Assyria? If they just swallowed down whatever they said, where would Jerusalem be at the end of that story? We have to be able to say, you know what, Mr. Assyrian general, you know what, I know you're selling all this sky is falling hysteria, but you know what, you don't even know God. You don't understand the first thing about our God. I do know God and I trust him. He knows me and he hears me, and so I'm not going to listen to you, Assyria. I'm going to trust and obey my God. Maybe a part of our problem is that we just have way more contact with faithless voices than we do with God. We listen to Assyrian generals more than we listen to Hezekiah and Isaiah. We take Absalom more seriously than we take David. What would be some modern versions of that? What does that look like today? Maybe it looks like this. Maybe it looks like we just watch the news a whole lot more than we read our Bible. And we communicate via Facebook way more than we communicate via prayer. And we talk about politics way more than we talk about God. And we worry and wring our hands way more than we pray. And brethren, if that's what we're doing, it's no wonder we think the sky is falling. David says when everyone says the sky is falling, you got to look at who you're listening to. And you got to step away from the faithless voices. Number 3, when everyone says the sky is falling, encourage your brethren. So, I want you to notice something else. In verses 2 and 3, David is addressing those ready to believe the lies of Absalom. In verses 4 and 5, I actually think David is speaking to a different group of people. I believe in verse 4, David now begins addressing those who are still loyal to him and yet have an equally unhealthy response to all the upheaval. You'll see what I mean. This is verse 4. He says, "Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord." So Absalom is evil. And Absalom does not have a claim to David's throne. And David is in a real mess. But the one who has been the primary victim of all this injustice, interestingly, seems to be the one who's calming everyone else down. And so David says in these verses, I believe to his outraged supporters about this, he says to them, guys, calm down. Yes, it's upsetting and scary, and yes, you have every right to be angry about what has happened. You can be indignant about evil, but you do not have an excuse to sin. You do not have a reason to sink to their level. He says, take a deep breath, do nothing impulsively. Here's what you need to spend your time doing right now. Worship God and trust Him. That when it seems like the sky is falling, we need to turn to one another with words like these. And so verse 4 again, be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. He says, before you work yourself into a frenzy because the sky is falling, first of all, just pause. Here's step one, pause. Don't say anything. Be silent. Go to bed. Sleep on it. Pray about it before you post the diatribe on Facebook. He might not have said that part. What verse 4 is an injunction against impulse. That's what verse 4 is. Because if you calm down and think, the initial hysterical feelings tend to fade. We get a little more perspective. Our worldview grows a little bit. That's what David wants us to do. Just calm down and pause for a minute. That's the first thing. You can't talk right now. He continues in verse 5 and he says, offer right sacrifices. What this is about worship. He says to them, go to worship. Don't stop worshiping because you're worried about this or that. If anything, you need worship now more than you ever did before. Reminds me a little bit of another famous psalm, Psalm 73. Psalm 73 is about a guy named Asaph. And Asaph is worrying himself sick over the good fortune of the wicked. He's eaten up with how good some wicked people have it and how terrible things seem to be going for him as he serves God. He's asking all the big questions about why bad things happen to good people and why good things happen to bad people. And he's saying, I do all this stuff for God for nothing. But the whole psalm turns on this phrase. It turns when he says, until I went to the sanctuary of God, then I discerned their end. See, Asaph says when you're eaten up with worry, when you're convinced the sky is falling, when the whole world is upside down and evil people have it so good and all of this, when all this is happening, here's what you do. You go worship, you offer your sacrifices, and when you do that, I guarantee you, your perspective will change. Asaph says you discern the end of things. You see to the end of it, not just the immediate moment. Asaph and David say, take your worries to the only God who can do anything about them. As one man put it, the fear of God is the one fear that drives out all other fears. David says, go worship, go learn to fear God, and when God starts to look more fearsome, your enemies will start to look more wimpy. Continue in verse 5, he says, put your trust in the Lord. I don't know how everything we're worried about is going to work out. I am not in this sermon being a Pollyanna about the world's problems. I'm not acting like I know that everything we're worried about, how it's all going to work out just the way we want. I don't know any of that. But what I am saying is, we must never forget the most important thing, and that is to put your trust in the Lord. If we fail in that, we have failed utterly. God is the only one who can do anything about anything anyway. God is the one who's going to right every wrong one day. God is the one who's going to save. God is the one who's going to judge, and no one will slip through the cracks. Don't forget to trust Him. So in verses 2 and 3, he addresses those who are caught up in the hysteria. In verses 4 and 5, he addresses those who are outraged about the ones caught up in hysteria. And he has a word for both parties I want you to see. The pro-Absalom party in verse 2 is obviously wrong because they believed lies. But now in verse 4, David says to the pro-David party, you have failed to put God on His throne too. See, we need our brethren when it seems like the sky is falling, because at times like that, we all begin to develop worldviews without a sovereign God on top. We need to be able to encourage one another with reminders like these, and we need to be encouraged by others reminding us. We need to say to one another what David says. We need to say, brother, calm down. Pause. You came to church a little worked up today. First of all, you can be angry about sin. There's plenty of Psalms where people are angry about sin, but you never have an excuse to sin in your outrage about sin. Brother, let's worship together. Let's remember that God is still God in every crisis and every upheaval. We need to come listen to a sermon for a minute. Which brings us to number 4. Fourth and finally, when everyone says the sky is falling, put your delight in God. So if David dealt with opponents in verses 2 and 3, and then outraged supporters in verses 4 and 5, I believe he now addresses maybe a slightly different group of people in verse 6. I imagine those who sort of stand apart from this whole political fracas, the people who perhaps come to believe the sky is falling, but instead of participating in the culture war, they simply resign themselves to doom. See if you can kind of pick up on their defeatism in verse 6. Verse 6, there are many who say, here's what many are saying, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. And now this is David's response, verse 7. You have put more joy in my heart than they, the warriors of verse 6, have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. So can you hear the worry in verse 6? Can you hear the hand-wringing, the defeatism? They say, who's going to help us? What can be done? Is God even there? I think they've swallowed down everything the men in verse 2 are dishing out. They've become defeatists. They fully expect and anticipate doom. David says in verse 6, there are many saying these things. Does David share their defeatism? Listen again to verse 7. You have put more joy in my heart than the verse 6 people have when their grain and wine abound. So, he compares the joy God has put in his heart at this moment to the joy the faithless have in times of plenty. David is full of more joy while in exile and on the run for his life. He has more joy at that moment than the faithless have in the most bountiful harvest. Now, how can that be the case? What sense does that make? Well, David has a peace and joy that transcend his immediate circumstances. That's what he's saying. His joy does not depend on how things seem to be going in his life or in the world at this moment. David's joy is not fickle. It's not on again, off again. I go outside in the morning and I see what the barometric pressure is and I figure out if I can have joy today or not. His joy does not depend on his circumstances or the latest news headline. David's joy is anchored in a relationship with a God who does not change. David is just like Paul in this way. Do you remember when Paul said this in Philippians 4? I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. See, Paul's joy and contentment was not based on the amount of grain and wine he had. It was not based on the happenings of the Roman Senate. It was not dependent on his current living situation. I'll remind you in Philippians, he's in prison as he writes these words. Paul says, my joy is based on God the Father and Jesus the Son. That's how we can have more joy when the sky is falling than the faithless have when they're prospering. The question being raised by David and Paul is this: what is your anchor? What is the thing in your life that gives you peace and joy and confidence? What's the one thing that has to be true in order for you to have a good day today? Because if that one thing is the amount of grain and wine you have, your joy will go away the second there's a drought. You won't have any joy. If your joy depends on the news cycle, you will never be joyful another day in your life. You won't have any real joy or real peace or real contentment until you can truthfully say what David says in verse 7. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. And finally, verse 8. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. In a setting of hysteria, with the sky falling, surrounded by lie-believing enemies in verse 2, outraged and impulsive supporters in verse 4, despairing defeatists in verse 6, how does the psalm end? What does David do? It says he lies down and he goes to sleep. How does he do that? He says, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. David says, I don't wait until every problem in the world is squared away before I can sleep well at night. I work on centering all my hope on God. And when I manage that, I have exactly what I need for peaceful sleep. In faith and trust in God, there is comfort and rest. in faithless consumption of the world's voices is only worry and restlessness. Only when we delight in God like David did can we sleep like David did in a world like ours. Only when our lives are consumed with God will we find real joy. Only then will we find the peace that passes understanding. So as we wrap up, let me say one more time, I'm not trying to dismiss, I'm not trying to make light of all the things that people worry about. There are plenty of things that I worry about. But what I am saying is that we do not have to join Chicken Little's hysterical parade to remember that the fox wants to keep us in that hysterical state of mind for his good, not for our good. We do not have to choose between the bad choices of this psalm. We don't have to choose between either being hysterical about the world's problems or mocking and being outraged about those who are hysterical about the world's problems, or just resigning ourselves to despair about the whole thing. We don't have to choose between those bad options. God's people respond to worry in a totally different way than the faithless do. As soon as you put God on his throne, the God who hears when I call him, the God who puts more joy in my heart in famine than the faithless have in abundance, as soon as that God gets put on his throne, the world starts to look like a very different place. And so the question is, who are you listening to? Whose words do you take most seriously? What group of people is reinforcing your worldview? Whose voice gets the most airtime in your ears? What's your real source of joy? And what has to happen in order for you to get a good night's sleep? In David's words, in peace, I will both lie down and sleep. How? For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. And it is my prayer that that will be your prayer tonight and every other night of your life. Maybe there's someone here this morning that realizes that you have bought into the hysteria of the world, that you have swallowed down what the world says you need to be worried about at every moment of every day. The good news is there is a God who does not change. The good news is there is a God who's coming again to right every wrong and to save his people and tie up every last loose end. Trust that God. Put your joy in him. Your life will be better now, and it will be bliss eternally. If there's anyone that needs to respond, come forward now as we stand and sing.